My Lords, I declare my interest as Chairman of Brineflow Limited, a director of farming company Century Limited, and I've spent over 30 years in the fertiliser industry. In the last 12 months, I've participated in some of the highest rating fertiliser-related videos on YouTube. They're not mucky videos, very educational, and I encourage you to look at them. Now, I congratulate the committee on this really valuable report, and I note the government's response. But it's about nearly 40 years since the Lordships published the Nitrate in Water paper in 1988-89, the 16th report. I won't go further. I know the companion says I shouldn't use visual aids, but but I remember the report well. As an agriculture student at Reading, whose dissertation was on nitrogen, the report featured on The Week in Westminster. So I wrote to the chairman, the noble Lord Middleton, and he kindly sent me a copy. And I tell the story because it demonstrates the historical as well as the current importance of this issue. In some respects, how little has changed, but in others, plenty, including the media's interest in this subject. Because as we've heard earlier in this debate, life without nitrogen isn't just unsustainable, it's impossible. It comprises 80% of the air we breathe. So it is almost paradoxical that we need to reduce, recycle and reuse something that is so ubiquitous and abundant. And that's why the committee was wise to use the term reactive nitrogen rather than risk confusion with the somewhat inert gaseous form. And looking back to 1989 and that report, it was a time when nitrogen applications of fertilisers were coming off record usage peaks. Indeed, over 1.5 million tonnes of elemental nitrogen was applied, much of it from 4 UK-based factories, before set-aside and other modulations like nitrate vulnerable zones had been introduced. Now, back then, noble lords were concerned about levels of nitrates in water, the consequences of ploughing up grassland, or even ploughing in vegetables, and the use of winter cover crops. They were concerned about limiting applications of fertilisers and manures with controls on livestock. And now, 40 years on, Baroness Sheehan's team is now familiar with all these issues. Back then, it was natural that artificial fertilisers were looked at, and the fertiliser regulations we use even today date from 1990, the year after Lord Middleton's report. Now, this new report highlights the same issues, but it's joined by other concerns about diffuse pollution implicated in eutrophication, when algae combine nitrogen with phosphates to bloom into impenetrable blanket weed. And if I may, it's that important interaction with phosphates from detergents, which causes the greening of the rivers, that causes so much concern. The report might have made more of. It isn't just animal wastes, important though they are. Noxes in the air are also an issue highlighted, although it's mainly from exhaust pollution and intensive livestock production, something the government's response accepts, and we welcome the recommendation to cover slurry lagoons, even though this government cancelled the grants that would have made that easier. I will return to the release of ammonia from urea fertilisers later, and the adverse consequences from the application of sewage sludges to land are now much more fully appreciated. Now, I've declared my interest, but artificial fertilisers often cop the blame for this, and unfairly in my view, because the truth is more complicated than it seems. The industry of which I am a part has made great strides in getting its house in order, and the fertiliser industry is indeed totally committed to increasing nutrient use efficiency by 1% a year each year for the next 20 years, using better husbandry techniques, emerging technologies to keep crops greener for longer, using things such as urease inhibitors, biological signalling compounds, new application practices and technologies, including abatement. There's an increasing use of liquid fertiliser with low emission profiles and nothing rattles in the hedges, combined with better advisory training and prescription-based approaches, focusing much less on what father and granddad did. There's a system of industry-led facts advisors with a level 5 qualification. We've heard from Lord Treves about precision application. There's a FIAS scheme, detonation resistance tests, and yes, those 1990 fertiliser regulations, which we hear will be reviewed to bring organics, slurries, sludges and digestates into scope, which is to be welcomed. Now, I was pleased that the committee recognised that the artificial use of fertilisers has fallen by 33% since 1989 to less than 1 million tonnes of elemental nitrogen. Land taken out of production is one explanation, but it's only part of the story. Those 4 domestic fertiliser factories have all closed, We no longer have a domestic primary production industry at all, which the report correctly tells us has reduced the industrial emissions of NOx gases here in the UK. But without the Haber-Bosch process, which captures the nitrogen from the air we breathe, the world could sustain perhaps only 3 or 4 billion, and there's currently 10 billion of us. So the reality and trade-off is without mineral nitrogen, 6 or 7 people, the equivalent of 16 people in this chamber, would have to go if we didn't have artificial fertilisers. It's a sobering thought. Now, the report enumerates well the problems of excess nitrogen, but if I may, I think it might have missed an opportunity to tell the positive story, that in aggregate, nitrogen makes cultivated land work harder, driving food security, sustaining the population, so you don't need as much land under the plough, leaving more, much more, for amenity and nature uses. And that's why I say to the noble Lord Krebs, that's why RB209 is still largely correct, because it optimises the economic response whilst allowing more land to be left for nature. Now, one big change since 1988-89 is that there are many more sources of organic manures, aggravated by the time of the year their nutrients are released to the environment. So in contrast with the 1 million tonnes of elemental nitrogen used today, there are 4 million tonnes of sewage sludge, over 200 million tonnes of FYM, farmyard manure, and slurries applied for land, and increasingly 20 million tonnes of new nitrogen and phosphate-rich digestates, the rocket fuel for algae, with the paradox that these anaerobic digestion plants, so-called green energy, are turning our rivers green with unmanageable volumes of slop. I do think the report could have said just a little bit more about the shift, not necessarily in the absolute quantities of organic manures, slurries, digestates, and sewage waste, but also about the consequences of the timing and seasonality of getting it wrong. Because you see, much of these organic manures are applied to the soil by regulation, at a time when, on account of cold soils, mostly at field capacity in the winter, and there are no growing crops to absorb the excess nutrients, so they go through the soil profile like a hot knife through butter into the groundwater and run off into rivers. And so if ever there was an example of unintended consequence, this is it. So I welcome the recognition by the committee that too many environmental advisors from so many departments and agencies parrot ever more complex and conflicting advice that makes the situation worse and makes it harder to extract values from these products that are a resource and aren't waste. The committee has correctly highlighted the complicated, piecemeal and fragmented policy and regulatory landscape, which has contributed to creating more perverse incentives that go against the Environmental Act objectives of purer water, cleaner air and less waste. So it's no wonder the regulations need to be reformed, and the committee has done valuable service in highlighting this in a most timely manner, and something the government has accepted in its response. Now, time prevents me from going down the rabbit hole of nutrient neutrality, one of my specialist subjects, but in a slight change of tack towards the end, I now is probably a good moment to warn of the ultimate perverse incentive that threatens to materially undo the progress that has been made and the committee seeks to make use of in the pursuit of cleaner air to breathe. We have the prospect of a misdirected introduction of new carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM taxes, on the 1st of January next year, ostensibly to reduce carbon leakage in the UK when we don't have any UK fertiliser production anymore, so it will do nothing to reduce global carbon emissions. These taxes, driven by the Treasury, who did not feature in the committee's regulators list on page 76 in paragraph 180, but should now do so, and DESNES have constructed an unmanageable scheme that creates the bizarre fiscal incentive to use the most polluting urea fertilisers which are restricted by DEFRA's option 4 on account of their adverse effects on NOx and ammonia. It's madness. Not only are they going to make the farmer's most expensive input about a quarter more expensive, it will push up the price of food that every family consumes every day in an inflationary spiral, in a direct assault on the cost of living from a Prime Minister that says that's what he wants to focus on. No wonder farmers can't make sense of the rules when even the government can't get its story straight. On one hand, they're trying to reduce NOx emissions, while on the other, fiscally making it more attractive to use the most polluting kind of fertilisers that drive particulates and respiratory problems. So I'm bound to say that the good work done by this report will be undone if the astonishing failure of His Majesty's Treasury, DEFRA, DESNES, and to a lesser extent MHCLG to talk to each other isn't made on this point, because it is the classic case of the government's left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. And the worst of all is penalising the greenest producers, like Proman in Trinidad, who capture all the CO2 from the steam reformation of natural gas, the precursor to the Haber-Bosch process, and turn it into valuable economic products, including clean-burning methanol, to power the latest generation of cargo ships. No CO2 is released there. And none of this is the fault of the committee, because CBAM is so new. But I wonder where, with their newfound expertise, the committee might be minded to reconvene to cover this narrow point before we take a terrible mistake that takes our environmental air quality backwards with perverse taxes as the reason. The committee could do the economy and the environment a valuable service by looking at these consequences before it's too late. So in conclusion, this is one of my specialist subjects, and possibly with a few minor changes in emphasis, the committee has masterfully collated the various technical, environmental and commercial and regulatory issues that trans so many different specialisms. I congratulate them. I'm only disappointed that their important report didn't feature on the week in Westminster, as their forebears did nearly 40 years ago.